The rain falls in sheets against the restaurant windows at 11:43 on a Thursday night. The November wind howls through the Chicago streets like something alive, something angry, and Reynolds stumbles through the mahogany doors of Russo's, her white uniform shirt torn and soaked crimson across her left side where her fingers press against a knife wound that will not stop bleeding. She is 29 years old but looking decades older, her pale face streaked with rain and something darker, her breath coming in ragged gasps that sound like a wounded animal trapped in the back of a delivery truck. She collapses against the hostess stand, her hand leaving a smear of blood on the polished wood. The scent of copper mingles with the restaurant's thick perfume of garlic, oregano, and wine. Her vision blurs at the edges like someone is dimming the lights slowly, methodically, and she whispers the only words that matter anymore. The twins. Are they safe? Please tell me they are safe. In the back room, behind the velvet curtain that separates the dining floor from the private booth where real business happens, Matteo Russo sits across from Sergio and Franco. The table holds 7 plates of untouched osso buco, 3 glasses of wine that cost $400 a bottle, and a manila folder thick with photographs. The folder sits closed between them like a bomb no one has detonated yet. Matteo is 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the chest of a man who has known violence and paid its price in scar tissue and sleepless nights. His hair is dark, combed back, and there is a scar that runs from his left eye to his cheekbone like someone once tried to cut the answers out of his face. His hands rest on the table, and on his left wrist sits a watch made of rose gold and Swiss precision, worth $73,000. He has been listening to Sergio explain the security concerns at the twins' private academy when every man in the restaurant dressed in a black suit stops moving at once. The sound is that distinct, not a crash or a bang but the sudden absence of sound, as if the world has held its breath. Then footsteps. Urgent. Unsteady. Matteo rises from the booth with the kind of movement that looks slow but covers distance like light, and Franco's phone is already in his hand. On the screen, black and white security footage shows a figure in a dark coat, moving fast, a blade catching the streetlight outside the school's wrought iron gates. 2 small figures in blue uniforms stand frozen. Then, a woman's body moves between them and the attacker. The blade finds her left side. She does not scream. Franco's voice is barely a whisper when he speaks. She took the blade. The woman jumped between them and the attacker. She took the blade meant for the twins. Matteo crosses the restaurant in 4 strides. The distance from his private booth to the hostess stand might as well be a bridge between 2 worlds. He moves through the dining room and the servers part like water around a stone, and he reaches Mia just as her knees buckle and the polished marble floor rises to meet her. He catches her. She is small and light like she has not eaten enough in months to take up her full weight, and her blood is warm and real on his expensive suit. He does not notice. He does not care. Her eyes find his, and the light in them is fading like candles that someone is snuffing out one by one. But in that fading light is something remarkable. Recognition. She looks at him with the eyes of a person who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to hide. I know who you are, she whispers, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. Your boys. They reminded me of my Ava. Just these 2 scared kids waiting by the gates like their mothers might actually show up to pick them up. I thought about my daughter and I could not let them bleed. Matteo holds her against his chest, his hand pressing against the wound to slow the bleeding, and something happens in his body that has not happened in 15 years. His chest tightens. His breath catches. The men in black suits watch him with eyes that have never seen this before. Sergio moves toward the phone. Ambulance is for minutes out. The attacker fled north on Ashland. We have 3 teams mobilizing. But Matteo is not listening to Sergio. He is looking at this woman whose name he does not yet know, this woman who took a knife meant for children who belong to a man she knows only by reputation and fear, and he thinks about his own father bleeding out in a warehouse when Matteo was 16 years old. He thinks about how his father's blood soaked into the concrete floor and stayed there for years, a dark stain that no one cleaned because everyone was too afraid to touch it. "What is your name?" he asks, and his voice sounds like thunder, like something that shakes the foundation of the building. "Mia," she says, and then her eyes close, and the hand that was pressed against her wound falls away. 3 days earlier, the world looked different. The fire started at 2:17 in the morning in the basement of the aging apartment building on the corner of Essex and Milwaukee. Mia was not home. She was working a double shift at Ashford's, the upscale Italian restaurant where she had been employed for 8 months as a server and part-time kitchen assistant, the kind of job that pays minimum wage plus tips minus the tips that Douglas Hale, the restaurant's general manager, steals from her apron pocket when he thinks she is not looking. The fire consumed her one-bedroom apartment in 16 minutes. The fire chief said later that the building was a tinderbox, that it was a miracle anyone got out alive, that the structural damage was beyond repair. What he did not say was that the apartment held everything Mia Reynolds owned in this world. It held her daughter Ava's school uniforms. It held her mother's wedding ring, the one piece of jewelry she wore on a chain around her neck beneath her uniform. It held the 2 blankets they used when the heat failed in winter. It held the envelope with $740 in cash hidden inside the flour canister, the money she had been saving for 3 years to pay for Ava's braces, money that disappeared as the flames climbed the walls. When the fire department called her at the restaurant at 2:58 in the morning, Mia was in the walk-in freezer rotating stock, her fingers numb and white with cold. The drive from Ashford's to the apartment took 12 minutes. She sat in her used Honda Civic with the cracked dashboard and watched the fire truck spray water on the smoking ruins, watched the flames lick through the windows like tongues, watched her entire life turn into ash and memory. She had $32 in her purse and a daughter sleeping at her sister's apartment for miles away, and she did not know how she was going to explain that everything they owned had burned. The next morning, Mia stood in the intake office of the city shelter and filled out forms that asked questions she could not answer. Do you have family? Do you have references? Do you have a permanent address? The caseworker, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes that had seen this before, looked at the burnt-out address and wrote it down. We have a room for you and your daughter. It is temporary. The maximum stay is 90 days. 90 days to rebuild a life that had been held together by threads so fragile they broke when the temperature climbed to 300 degrees. The shelter smelled like industrial cleaner and despair. The room was 12 by 14 feet with 2 twin beds, a desk, and a window that looked out on a brick wall. Mia lay awake on the first night listening to Ava breathe, listening to the sounds of other families in other rooms, and she did something she had not done in 4 years. She cried. By the next morning, she had stopped crying and started working. She called her boss Douglas Hale at Ashford's and told him she was still coming to work. She worked the lunch shift. She worked the dinner shift. She worked the late-night cleanings when the restaurant was empty except for the owner, Victoria Ashford, who sat in the office with the door open, watching the servers move through the dining room like she was evaluating pieces of equipment. Victoria Ashford was 53 years old, tall and thin like someone had stretched her too much, with hair the color of champagne and clothes that cost more than a car payment. She owned the restaurant the way people own museums, with a sense of possession that extended to the people who worked there. She had invented a story about Mia that spread through the restaurant staff like a virus. The story was that Mia was unreliable. The story was that her daughter had behavioral problems. The story was that she had been fired from her last 3 jobs for the same reasons. None of the story was true, but truth is fragile and rumors are strong, and by the end of Mia's second week back at work, the other servers had stopped inviting her to sit with them during break. It was Douglas Hale who discovered the real opportunity. He was 47 years old with the kind of smile that made his eyes smaller, and he had worked at Ashford's for 13 years in a position of minor power that he wielded like a weapon. He controlled the schedule. He controlled the tips. He controlled who worked the profitable shifts and who worked the slow nights, and one Wednesday afternoon, he found Mia counting her tips in the empty dining room before the evening service. She had made $17 on a 4-hour lunch shift. "You look tired," he said, and his voice had a texture like oil on water. The shelter life is not treating you well. She did not answer. She kept counting. I could move you to better shifts, he continued. The Friday and Saturday nights. The private parties. The tips there are much better. But I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands how things work. Someone who understands reciprocity. Mia looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw a calculation so detailed and specific that it was almost impressive. He had already decided what she was. He had already decided what she would do. I am not interested, she said, and she put her $17 in her pocket. Something cold moved across his face. You should reconsider. The shelter has rules about length of stay. After 90 days, you and your daughter will have to find somewhere else. Where do you think you will go? How many landlords are willing to rent to a woman with no income, no references, and a burnt-out apartment on her record? The question hung in the air like smoke. That Friday, Victoria Ashford pulled Mia aside and told her that she was being moved to slower shifts, that her performance had not met expectations, that she was costing the restaurant money. Mia did not argue. She signed the new schedule without speaking, and that night she sat on the twin bed next to her sleeping daughter and opened the envelope she had hidden in her suitcase. It contained the list of debts that did not belong to her. Her late husband, Michael, had died 4 years ago in a car accident that was not an accident at all. The police report said he had a blood alcohol level of .27, that he had driven his car at 70 miles per hour into a concrete barrier on the expressway. What the police report did not say was that Michael owed money to people who break legs as casually as other people break promises. The debts were in his name, but in the eyes of the creditors, they belonged to his widow. The envelope held 7 pages of handwritten accounts. Money borrowed from private lenders. Money for gambling debts at a poker table that ran out of the basement of a warehouse near the docks. Money that came with interest rates that climbed like ivy. The total was $47,000. $47,000. Mia had $200 in her pocket. The calculation was not complicated. The wind outside the shelter window rattled the glass, and somewhere in the darkness of Chicago, at the same moment, Matteo Russo was signing paperwork that would move $13 million from one account to another. The money was legitimate now, laundered through restaurants and real estate companies and a security firm that employed 300 men. But money does not lose its origin. It was built on decades of choices that could not be unmade, and Matteo carried those choices like a passenger in his chest. He did not know yet that his world was about to intersect with Mia Reynolds. He did not know that this woman existed, that she was lying awake counting the days until the shelter turned her out, that she was making a list of options and crossing them off one by one until nothing remained but desperation. But somewhere in the city, the dice were rolling. Somewhere, the knife that would draw blood had not yet been forged. Somewhere, a moment was approaching that would shatter both of their lives into pieces, and neither of them knew it yet. Before we continue, drop a like if this story is hitting you. Share it with someone who needs to hear what happens next, and subscribe so you do not miss a single moment of what is coming tomorrow. Now let us dive back deeper into the life that Mia Reynolds was living before the knife, before the blood, before she became the woman who saved 2 children she had never met. Monday morning arrived without mercy. The November sky hung low and gray over the Lakewood apartments, and firefighters sprayed the last of the flames with water that turned the charred brick black as a tomb. Mia Reynolds stood on the sidewalk, her shoulders wrapped in a Red Cross blanket that smelled like industrial detergent and someone else's grief. In her left arm she held Ava, her 5-year-old daughter, who wore borrowed clothes 2 sizes too large, a pink sweatshirt with a cartoon mouse, gray sweatpants rolled at the waist. In her right hand, Mia clutched a single photograph. It was warped from the heat, the edges curling like burned paper, but the image remained intact, her late husband Marcus in his navy dress blues, his arm around Ava when she was just an infant, both of them smiling at a moment that no longer existed. "Mommy, where will we sleep tonight?" Ava's voice was small, the kind of small that contains an entire universe of trust and terror combined. Mia felt the question move through her chest like a blade. She pressed her lips together, held them there for a long moment, and when she finally spoke her voice came out steady, each word placed carefully like she was building a bridge across an impossible distance. "We will figure it out, baby. We always figure it out." But her hands were shaking. The fire inspector had approached her 30 minutes earlier with a clipboard and a tired expression. He had done this before, many times, and explained in the flat tone of a man delivering the same bad news over and over that the fire had started in the electrical system. The wiring in the basement was decades old, not up to code, a hazard waiting for the spark that would ignite everything. Mia had asked the landlord about those repairs 8 months ago. She had knocked on his door with a list of problems, the sparking outlets, the smell of burning rubber coming from the walls at night. He had told her that repairs would raise the rent, and she was already behind on 3 months of payments because Marcus had died, because the medical bills had swallowed everything, because the world did not slow down or make exceptions for women whose husbands stopped breathing. Now the building smoldered behind her, and everything she owned was ash. Ava's stuffed animals, a purple elephant named Gerald and a pink rabbit named Snow, had been sleeping in the dresser when the flames came. Marcus's wedding ring, the only piece of him she had left besides memories and a 5-year-old girl with his exact brown eyes, had been in a box on the nightstand. Every photograph, every document, every shred of evidence that her life had existed before this moment, gone. The shelter had space for 1 week. 1 week to find an apartment, find the money for a deposit, find a reason to believe that anything would ever be simple again. The shelter room smelled like industrial cleaner and resignation. Mia sat on the narrow bed at midnight, Ava already asleep beside her, the child's hand wrapped around her mother's pinky finger even in dreams. The window overlooked an alley where rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming against the glass with the rhythm of a clock counting down. Mia pulled out a piece of paper from the shelter's donation bag, white, lined, the kind they used to write grocery lists, and began to write. The list had grown. It had started 3 years ago when Marcus got sick, when the diagnosis came back as stage 4 and the treatments cost more than their annual rent. It had continued when he died, when the funeral expenses came due, when the creditors started calling with numbers that seemed to multiply like bacteria. Credit card debt from 8 years of trying to stay afloat, $12,400. Medical bills marked past due in red ink, $18,200. A personal loan from Marcus's brother that she could no longer pay, $9,000. And then the final number, the one that made her stomach clench, a debt that Marcus had accumulated through gambling, through late-night poker games in the back of a bar called the Lucky Seven, through a man named Vincent Carletti who had given him extensions and promises and then, when the sickness made him unable to work, called in the Marcus with the kind of interest that belonged in another century. $16,000. Plus interest. The total was $47,000. $47,000. Mia had $200 in her pocket, the emergency fund she had kept in a mason jar in the kitchen, the only money that survived the fire because she had been carrying it with her when she went back in to find Ava's shoes. The math was not complicated. She had 12 days according to the final notice letter, the one printed in threatening red lettering that arrived at the shelter on Tuesday morning. 12 days to produce money she did not have, could not earn, could not imagine existing in any form. Tuesday evening came with the sound of rain and the smell of basil. Mia stood in the kitchen of Ashford's, the upscale Italian restaurant where she had worked for the past 4 years of double shifts, of sore feet, of smiling at people who moved through the world with the kind of confidence that came from never having to choose between groceries and medication. The restaurant gleamed like a jewelry box. Warm amber lighting hung from wrought iron fixtures, casting everything in the color of honey and expensive whiskey. The tables were dressed in white linen, the plates were rimmed in gold, the wine glasses cost more than she made in a day. The kitchen hummed with the sound of simmering marinara, fresh basil crushing under knives, the particular music of a place where people paid $80 for a plate of pasta because they could. Douglas Hale's office was on the 2nd floor, hidden behind a locked door marked staff only. He was early 40s, the kind of man who spent money on his appearance and believed it made him important. His hair was slicked back with pomade, his watch was a Rolex that caught the light when he moved, his suit was tailored in a way that suggested he went to the same tailor as men who actually had legitimate businesses. He sat on the edge of his desk when Mia entered, positioned his body too close to hers, and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Mia! Come in, come in." His voice was the color of oil. "I heard about your little fire. Terrible tragedy. Losing your home, your things. Your daughter must be absolutely traumatized." Mia said nothing. She had learned that saying nothing was sometimes the only strategy that kept the world from getting worse. Douglas opened the cash box where tips were counted, where money was distributed each night to the servers who had earned it through hours of service and small humiliations. He counted out the bills slowly, deliberately, and then set aside 3 20s, $60, and folded them into his own pocket without looking at her. "Consider it a loan, Mia. You are going to need my goodwill now, aren't you? With your circumstances. A single mother, no home, no resources." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times before. "I could make your life very difficult. Or I could make it easier. The choice is yours." "I don't understand." Her voice came out small, uncertain, the way they all sounded once he had finished with them. "You work the shifts I tell you to work. You keep your mouth shut about how I manage the tip pool. And you do not go complaining to Victoria about anything, nothing, that happens in this restaurant. You understand me? Because if you do, I will mention to her that you have been unstable lately. A woman dealing with a traumatic loss, grief, financial ruin. That is unstable, Mia. That is someone who might make mistakes. That is someone who might not be reliable enough to trust with a job." The door to the office opened. Victoria Ashford filled the frame like a painting that had stepped off the wall. She was 53 years old, the daughter of a railroad tycoon, a woman who had inherited everything and learned to wield it like a weapon. Her hair was silver, perfectly coiffed in waves that suggested a salon appointment every 2 weeks. She wore pearls, real ones, the kind that cost as much as Mia's monthly rent had been before the fire, and a dress in pale blue that probably cost as much as 2 months of her salary. Her eyes moved over Mia with the expression of someone looking at a stain on a tablecloth. "Douglas is quite right, dear." Her voice was the texture of expensive chocolate, smooth and cold. "We have all noticed that you seem rather fragile these days. The fire, the loss, the strain of single motherhood. It is such a delicate situation. Such a fragile position to be in." She stepped closer, and Mia caught the scent of perfume so expensive it made her dizzy. "I would hate to have to let you go. Where would you even go? Who would hire someone with your circumstances? A widow, a fire victim, no permanent address? It would be such a shame to lose this opportunity." Mia's hands gripped the money, $370, after the 60 Douglas had stolen, and she nodded. She nodded, and she felt something inside her chest collapse like a building being demolished from the inside out. That night, Mia sat on the edge of the shelter bed and pulled out her phone. The banking app opened to a screen that now read the most terrifying number she had ever seen, $200. That was all. The remainder of her emergency fund. Everything else had burned, or been stolen, or had never existed in the first place. She had rent due for a place she no longer had. She had the fire damage, the deductible the insurance would not cover because her landlord had not maintained the building to code. She had a daughter who asked every morning if they could go home, and every morning Mia had to tell her again that home was gone. The handwritten list sat on the nightstand, and she picked it up with trembling fingers. The numbers seemed to grow even as she looked at them. She had added a new one that afternoon. A collections agency had called the shelter's main line, had somehow found her there, had left a message that made the shelter director's eyes go tight and sympathetic. $3,200 in past due credit card payments. The list kept growing. Every day brought a new creditor, a new name, a new sum of money that she did not have and could not possibly earn, not in 12 days, not in 12 years. Rain fell harder against the shelter window, drumming in endless patterns against the glass. Mia pressed her forehead to the cool pane and looked out at the Chicago streets below, at the empty sidewalks, the closed storefronts, the places where people like her disappeared into the shadows. Somewhere in the city, at that exact moment, Matteo Russo sat in the back room of a restaurant not unlike Ashford's, and he was reviewing numbers on a financial statement. The restaurant was legitimately profitable now, or at least it appeared that way to the accountants who asked no questions. The real money had been laundered through real estate holdings, through a security company that employed 300 men, through import-export businesses that specialized in moving things that were not quite legal but close enough that the authorities had learned not to ask too many questions. Matteo was 38 years old, and he had spent 22 of those years building an empire on the ashes of a tragedy that no one alive except him fully understood. His father had been murdered when Matteo was 16, a rival family had made a move, had calculated wrong, had lost. The body had been found in an abandoned warehouse, and young Matteo had stood over his father's corpse and made a decision that changed every moment of his life after that single choice. He would never be vulnerable again. He would never allow anyone to take anything from him that he did not choose to surrender. He would build a fortress so impenetrable that the world outside would learn to fear the very ground he walked on. Now he sat in the candlelit back room, and he did not know that his world was about to collide with a woman named Mia Reynolds. He did not know that she existed, that she was lying awake at that very moment counting the days until the shelter turned her out, that she was making lists of options and crossing them off one by one until nothing remained but the final choice, the one she could not bring herself to write down yet. He did not know that the dice were rolling, that somewhere in the machinery of fate and chance and the random cruelty of the universe, a moment was being forged that would shatter both of their lives into pieces. The rain fell harder. Mia pulled Ava closer. And in the darkness, neither of them knew that what was coming would change everything. The rain fell harder against the windshield, a sound like 1,000 fingers drumming on glass. Mia's hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, her knuckles white with tension, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. November wind tore through the highway in brutal gusts, and her 15-year-old sedan groaned under the pressure like a dying animal. Ava sat in the back seat, wrapped in a thin blanket that had once been blue but now was the color of old dishwater, her small face turned toward the window where rain streaked down in rivulets that caught the occasional flash of distant neon. The grinding noise under the hood had started 3 weeks ago. Mia had ignored it because ignoring problems was cheaper than fixing them. But now, at 10:19 p.m. on a Wednesday night in the middle of Interstate 90, the grinding had become a high-pitched scream, and then smoke, thick, dark, choking smoke, began pouring from beneath the hood. Mia's heart kicked against her ribs. She eased onto the shoulder, her hazard lights flashing like a desperate heartbeat, and turned the key. The engine coughed once. Twice. Dead. "Mommy, I'm cold." Ava's voice was small, terrified, the voice of a 5-year-old who had already learned that when things went wrong, they went very wrong. Mia turned around, reaching over the seat to pull her daughter close, wrapping her in the thin blanket and her own trembling arms. The heater had stopped working 2 months ago. The windows fogged with their combined breath. "It's okay, baby. We're okay. Mommy will fix this." But she would not fix this. She could not fix this. She had $200 left in her checking account. $200. The number had burned itself into her brain like a brand mark. Rent was due in 6 days. Food was running out. And now her car was dead on a dark highway in a storm that showed no sign of stopping. Her phone lay on the passenger seat, screen cracked from when she had dropped it last week. Battery indicator showed 4%. She stared at the phone the way a drowning person stares at shore that is still too far to reach. There was no one to call. Her parents had died in a car accident 12 years ago. Marcus's family had blamed her when he'd had his heart attack, blamed her for not knowing about the gambling, for not catching the debt spiral before it had consumed everything they'd built. Her friends, the ones from before, the ones she used to laugh with, had quietly disappeared the moment the money ran out, as if poverty was contagious and they needed to maintain distance. She was utterly alone. The wind howled through the gaps in the door seals. Ava shivered against her chest. And Mia made a decision that surprised even herself. She would wait. Someone would pass. Someone would stop. Someone always did, eventually. What she did not know was that 5 black SUVs were exactly 14 minutes away, moving through the rain like predators moving through water, sleek and purposeful and impossibly expensive. Matteo Russo sat in the middle SUV, leather interior that smelled like money and power, his body relaxed but his mind working. He had just come from a meeting with 3 businessmen who had tried to negotiate terms with him as if they had leverage. They did not have leverage. No one had leverage against Matteo Russo. He had explained this to them using only his eyes and the sound of his voice dropping 2 octaves. They had signed the papers. Sergio, riding in the front passenger seat, had smiled to himself. After 22 years of working for this man, Sergio knew that the scariest moment was when Matteo stopped shouting and started whispering. That was when people understood they had made a terrible mistake. The radio crackled. "Boss, we've got a disabled vehicle ahead. Shoulder of the highway, hazards on." Matteo's hand moved up, a gesture. "Slow down. Check it out." The convoy decelerated. Through the rain-streaked window, Matteo saw the sedan first, a relic from another decade, chrome rusted, paint faded to a dull grey. Then he saw the shape in the driver's seat. A woman. Alone. With a child in back. Something in his chest moved. He had not let anything move in his chest in a very long time. "Pull over," he said, his voice quiet but final. Sergio turned. "Boss, we don't know." "Pull over, Sergio." The SUV glided to a stop 50 yards behind the dead sedan. Matteo stepped out into the November rain without hesitation, his black overcoat immediately soaked through, rain streaming down his face in cold rivulets. He was 41 years old and he carried himself like a man who had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. His face was sharp, angular, carved from granite and shadows. A thin scar ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, a souvenir from a business negotiation gone wrong. His eyes were dark as a winter sky before a storm. He had been 16 years old when his father died. He remembered the sound, a gunshot that echoed through their apartment, and then his mother's scream, and then the silence that swallowed everything that came after. His father had been a good man, an honest man, a man who believed in rules and fairness and the basic decency of his fellow humans. His father had been murdered by men who understood none of these things. Young Matteo had stood over his father's body in an abandoned warehouse and made a choice that rewrote his entire life. He would never be vulnerable. Never. He would build a fortress so impenetrable that the world outside would learn to fear the very shadow he cast. He would amass power like other men amassed wealth, and he would use that power to ensure that what happened to his father would never happen to anyone he chose to protect. Now he approached the sedan and tapped on the window. Mia flinched. Her hand trembled as she cracked it open 3 inches, just far enough to see the man outside. What she saw made her breath catch. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders that suggested a gymnasium membership or genetics built for violence. His black overcoat probably cost more than everything she owned. His face was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. He looked like he had been carved to cause pain or prevent it, and both seemed equally likely. "You need help," he said. Not a question. His voice was deep and steady, the voice of someone who was used to being obeyed. "I'm fine," Mia whispered. "Just a broken alternator, probably. I can call." "Who?" His gaze was direct, unblinking. "Call who? You have someone nearby? Family? Friends?" She did not answer. Her silence answered for her. "You have a daughter," he said, and it was not a question either. "Let me get you somewhere safe." Behind him, she could see movement in the black SUVs. Men in dark suits emerging, hands near jacket pockets where weapons presumably waited. This was the moment where good decision-making ended. This was the moment where Mia should have rolled up the window, locked the doors, and prayed that a highway patrol car would pass before whatever was happening could escalate. But Ava was shivering. And she had $200. And this man's eyes held no cruelty, only something that looked like recognition, as if he saw her drowning and understood because he had done some drowning of his own. Where would we go? She asked. Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe. I give you my word. She did not know that his word was currency in this city, that men had died for breaking promises to this man, that his word was the closest thing to holy in the underworld of Chicago. She only knew that her daughter was cold and she had nowhere else to go. Okay, she heard herself say. 20 minutes later, Mia and Ava sat in the warm leather interior of Matteo's SUV, the heater running full blast, the scent of expensive cologne and something like cedar wood surrounding them. Matteo sat across from them, water dripping from his overcoat onto the floor. His men occupied the other vehicles. No one spoke. The only sound was the rain against the windows and Ava's breathing slowly becoming less panicked. Hotel on Oak Street, Matteo said to Sergio without looking away from Mia. The one that takes cash, no questions asked. She and her daughter stay there until I say otherwise. I pay for 1 week in advance. Yes, boss, Sergio said. Matteo leaned forward slightly. What is your name? Mia Reynolds, she whispered. This is my daughter, Ava. Matteo Russo, he said. You are safe now. That part is finished. She wanted to believe him. Some part of her, the part that was drowning, wanted to surrender to the possibility that salvation had arrived on a dark highway wrapped in a black overcoat. But Mia had learned years ago that safety was temporary and kindness usually came with a price. I don't understand why you're helping me, she said quietly. Matteo studied her face, his dark eyes moving across her features as if he was reading something written there that only he could decode. Because someone should have stopped for my mother, he said, and then looked away. The SUV moved through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago, and neither of them knew that by tomorrow evening, when Mia reported to her shift at Ashford's restaurant, her life would be divided into the time before this night and everything that came after. The gymnasium doors burst open at 8:44 in the morning, and Matteo Russo was not there. He was 3 miles away in a steel and glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, sitting in a mahogany conference room with shipping manifests spread across a table that cost more than most people's houses. 12 men in tailored suits filled the space, their voices creating a low hum of commerce and calculation. Matteo sat at the head of the table, his dark eye scanning figures, his gold watch catching the November light. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly pressed, a white shirt open at the collar. At 42, he looked like a man who had never known a soft day in his life, and he hadn't. His phone vibrated once. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession. He ignored it. Phones rang in his world 1,000 times a day. Most of them were not emergencies. The fourth call came through his private line. The one only his inner circle possessed. Matteo picked it up without excusing himself. The men in the room continued speaking, but their words faded into background noise. They had learned long ago not to interrupt when that phone rang. Boss. Sergio's voice cracked. Actually cracked. Sergio, who had worked for him for 15 years, who had witnessed violence that would break ordinary men, whose composure was legendary. What happened? Matteo said. Not a question. The boys. St. Augustine Academy. 8:42 this morning. Someone tried. Sergio's breathing came fast. There was a man with a knife. Marco and Luca, they were on the playground. But Mia Reynolds saw him approaching. She ran. The blade went into her side. She's bleeding. Paramedics are here. She's conscious but... The phone stayed in Matteo's hand, but the world inverted. Every cell in his body recognized a single fact: the only woman he had allowed into his life, the woman who had somehow bypassed every wall he had spent 25 years constructing, was bleeding in front of his sons. He did not remember standing. He did not remember his men's voices calling after him or the sound of his chair toppling backward. The next moment existed in fragments, his hand on his car door, the engine roaring to life, rain streaming across the windshield, his fingers tight on the steering wheel as the city blurred past. St. Augustine Academy sat on a tree-lined street in Lincoln Park. Police cars and an ambulance occupied the front, their lights painting the grey morning in alternating red and blue. Matteo's black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, and he was moving before the vehicle stopped completely. The paramedics had Mia on a stretcher. Her left side was wrapped in white gauze already blooming with red. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused, but when she saw him she tried to smile. The effort visibly cost her. "Your boys," she whispered. "They're okay?" He knelt beside the stretcher, and for the first time in a decade, his hand shook. Not from rage. From fear. Raw, animal fear that transformed him into something other than a boss, other than a ruler of men. "Yes. They're safe." His voice came out like gravel. "Because of you." "Someone should have stopped for my mother," he heard himself say, and the words surprised him even as they left his mouth. A truth he had never spoken aloud, never admitted existed. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. Matteo climbed in without asking permission. His men knew better than to follow. During the drive to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, he held her hand. Her skin was cold. The paramedic worked steadily on her side, and Mia's eyes closed, her breathing becoming shallow. Matteo watched her face, this woman who had materialized on a highway in the rain 12 days ago, and he understood something with sudden, terrible clarity. He had built an empire that meant nothing if she was not in it. The hospital received her at 8:59 in the morning. Surgery began at 9:34. Matteo sat in the waiting room still wearing his blood-stained suit. Sergio stood 6 feet away, Franco near the door, both men maintaining a perimeter that kept the hospital staff and other families at distance. Marco and Luca sat on either side of him, their 7-year-old faces small and frightened, their school uniforms still pristine from the morning they had planned to live. Marco reached up and tugged his father's jacket. "Is Miss Mia going to die?" Matteo pulled both boys against his chest. His sons, who had never seen him express fear, felt him trembling. "No. I won't let her." Franco's phone buzzed silently in his pocket. He checked it and turned away to answer. When he returned, he bent low and whispered. Matteo's jaw tightened. His expression shifted from fear to something colder, more lethal. Sergio noticed. In 15 years, he had learned to read the infinitesimal changes in his boss's face. Rage arriving was always quiet at first. The hospital room fell into that horrible silence that comes before a storm. 3 blocks away, in the manager's office at Ashford's restaurant, Douglas Hale sat at his desk watching his phone. He was a man of 51, with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who had never worked for his prosperity. His shirt was expensive but wrinkled. His eyes held the particular cruelty of a weak man given temporary power. Victoria Ashford had called him 20 minutes ago. "The plan failed," she said, her voice tight. The Russo woman intervened. "She's at Northwestern Memorial. In surgery." "So?" Douglas had replied, not understanding yet. "So, you idiot, Matteo Russo now knows exactly how much you've been stealing. He's going to come for you. We both miscalculated what he would do to protect his children." She had hung up without listening to his response. Douglas sat now in his locked office, the sound of the restaurant humming beyond the door, the clink of glasses, the murmur of lunch service beginning, and realized he was not going to leave this office as a free man. He knew the men who worked in this city. He knew what happened to people who failed to kill Matteo Russo's children. He pulled out his phone and began deleting messages. Too late. He knew it was too late. Back at the hospital, at 2:41 in the afternoon, a surgeon emerged and found Matteo standing near a window overlooking the city. The doctor was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had sewn human beings back together for 3 decades. "She's going to be fine," the surgeon said. The blade missed her organs by less than an inch. 12 stitches. "She'll have a scar, but she'll heal." Matteo exhaled for the first time in hours. At 3:33 in the morning the following Saturday, November rain hammered the windows of the safe house Matteo had secured for Mia. It was a clean place, modern, 2 bedrooms, completely private. Ava slept in one room. Mia sat alone in the kitchen in a borrowed nightgown, her left side wrapped in fresh bandages, her hands trembling. On the table in front of her sat a piece of paper and a pen. She had been awake for hours, watching the rain, thinking about the moment the knife approached Matteo's sons. She saw it in perfect clarity, the man's face, the blade catching light, the way her body had simply moved without consulting her brain. No hesitation. No calculation. Just the pure instinct of a mother protecting children that belong to someone else. And that realization broke something open in her chest. She picked up the pen. Her handwriting was unsteady, the letters bleeding slightly where her hands trembled. Matteo, I can't stay. Not because you haven't been kind. You've been kinder than anyone in my entire life. But I see what happens to the people around you. Danger follows you like a shadow. I can't let Ava grow up in that world. I can't risk her safety, even for, she paused, the pen hovering. Even for love. And yes, that's what this is. Love. Even though it's been less than 2 weeks. Even though it's insane. I love you, and that's exactly why I have to leave. Thank you for showing me that good men still exist in this city. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. I'll never forget you. She signed it, sealed it in an envelope, and set it on the table where he would find it. The sound came before the door opened. Footsteps on hardwood, measured and unhurried. Matteo entered the kitchen at 3:51 in the morning, still dressed in a charcoal suit from a meeting. His dark eyes found the envelope immediately. He read it standing there, the paper held in both hands, his shoulders going rigid. When he looked up at her, his face was raw in a way that men like him rarely allowed themselves to become. "You're not leaving," he said. "I have to." Tears streamed down her face. "You almost lost your sons because of me. I almost lost you because you saved them. That's not the same." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. "I've spent 25 years building walls around myself. And you walked through them like they were made of paper. You don't get to leave now." "I'm not strong enough for this world," she whispered. He knelt in front of her. His hands took hers. These hands that had signed the deaths of men now trembled as they held a woman who had thrown herself between a blade and his children. "You jumped in front of a knife for 2 boys you didn't know. You're the strongest person I have ever met." She broke apart in his arms. But what she did not know was that while she wrote her goodbye letter, Matteo had already set in motion the complete and systematic destruction of Douglas Hale and Victoria Ashford. Justice was coming. And it would be absolute. Monday morning arrived grey and cold. At 6:03 a.m., 12 FBI agents in tactical gear assembled outside Victoria Ashford's Lakeshore Drive penthouse. They had spent 72 hours gathering evidence, $340,000 embezzled by Douglas Hale over 3 years, funneled into offshore accounts. Tax evasion spanning a decade. Illegal real estate schemes. Wire transfers to organized crime figures. And security footage from the school showing Douglas Hale meeting with the man who carried the knife 3 days before the attack. The evidence was overwhelming. Federal level. Prison time certain. Victoria answered the door in a silk robe the color of champagne, her face registering shock for perhaps 2 seconds before it hardened into imperious denial. "This is absurd," she said. "I'm a respected businesswoman." The lead agent held up printed pages thick as a manuscript. "You're a criminal. You funded an attack on children." They cuffed her in front of her neighbors, who filmed everything on their phones. Her silk robe became a perp walk. Her Lakeshore Drive address became a crime scene. By 6:56 a.m., the footage had reached the first news station. By 7:15, it was on social media. By 8 o'clock, it had been viewed 200,000 times. At 11:02 a.m., Douglas Hale was arrested at Ashford's restaurant during lunch service. He tried to run. His foot caught on a table leg. He fell hard onto the black and white checkered floor, and his hands scrambled, his body moving like a wounded animal making one last desperate escape. The other staff froze, watching their manager reduced to something primal and helpless. "Please," he begged as the officers cuffed him. "Please, I didn't mean, it wasn't supposed to happen like this." Sergio stood in the background with his arms crossed, ensuring every moment was documented. Every sob. Every moment of degradation. The footage uploaded to every news outlet in Chicago within the hour. Victoria Ashford and Douglas Hale's empires collapsed in real time on television screens across the city. Their allies abandoned them immediately. Their accounts froze. Their lawyers scrambled. Federal prosecutors prepared cases that would put them both away for 40 years minimum. And Matteo Russo never appeared in a single frame of footage. He was a ghost in his own reckoning, invisible but omnipresent, justice delivered without his face ever touching the light. What Mia Reynolds learned that evening when Matteo returned to the safe house and told her what had happened was that love in this world was not weakness. It was the most dangerous weapon of all. Family is not always bound by blood but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives. The study smelled of leather and old wood and leather-bound secrets. Afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Matteo Russo sat across from Mia Reynolds in a wingback chair that cost more than her last 3 months of rent, and he held an envelope in his hands like it was made of something fragile. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her spine rigid, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white. A week had passed since she threw herself in front of the knife meant for his twins. 7 days since the blade had cut through her shoulder, since the blood had soaked her shirt, since everything she knew about her own capacity for love and terror had been rewritten in scarlet. The safe house had been a refuge. Clean sheets, warm food, Ava sleeping through the night without nightmares for the first time in months. But this was his private estate outside Chicago, a sprawling property wrapped in security gates and manicured grounds that stretched toward a tree line like a fortress pretending to be a home. The main house rose 3 stories, all pale stone and dark windows, with gardens that had been sculpted by someone who understood beauty as a form of power. Matteo leaned forward slightly, and the movement was deliberate, controlled, the way he moved everything. "Open it," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "I can't." Mia's voice trembled like a candle in the wind. "Whatever this is, I can't accept it." "You already did when you saved my sons." She shook her head, but her hands were moving forward anyway, drawn by gravity she couldn't resist. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, expensive in a way that made her feel poor just by proximity. She opened the seal with her thumb, and inside were checks. Multiple checks, each one a small blade of reality slicing through her denial. She read the names of the creditors. Hospital. Credit card company. The funeral home where they had buried her husband. And the amount, every single amount adding up to exactly $47,000. No. She stood up so quickly the envelope dropped from her fingers and scattered checks across the hardwood floor like confessions. "No, absolutely not. I can't accept this. You've already given me." The hotel was protection, Matteo interrupted, his eyes never leaving her face. The security, the safe house, that was necessary. Getting rid of Douglas Hale and Victoria Ashford wasn't a gift, Mia. That was justice. That was them paying for what they tried to do to you. She paced to the window, needing distance from him, from the weight of what he was offering. Outside, through the glass, she could see the backyard. Marco and Luca were there with Ava, building something with blankets and pillows, their voices carrying on the December wind like music from another world. Her daughter was laughing. Actually laughing. The sound was so foreign, so precious, it nearly broke her. "Then what is this?" She turned back to face him, and her voice cracked. "What are you trying to do to me, Matteo?" He stood slowly, moving with the careful grace of someone who had spent his life calculating every gesture. He crossed the study and pressed another envelope into her hands. This one was different. Heavier. Official. "That's yours," he said quietly. "A deed." 3-bedroom brownstone in Lincoln Park. Backyard. Safe neighborhood. Ava can walk to school. She can play outside and you won't wake up at 3 in the morning wondering if she's still breathing. Mia opened the deed with shaking hands. The address swam in front of her eyes. Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park was where people lived who had never waited tables for loose change. Where children had art classes and piano lessons. Where winter meant snow on clean sidewalks, not ice covering broken asphalt. No, she whispered. This is too much. You're trying to buy me. You're trying to. I'm trying to give you a life. His voice didn't rise, but something in it made the air change. Like a door had been opened somewhere behind his words. You jumped in front of a knife, Mia. A blade meant for my children. You didn't hesitate. You didn't calculate whether you could afford the hospital bill. You just moved. You chose my sons over your own safety. She couldn't look at him. If she looked at him, she would fall apart entirely. That deed comes with no conditions, he continued. You can take it and walk away right now. Move into that house tomorrow. Build the life you've been working double shifts to build. And it's still yours. No obligation. No debt. Nothing. And if I don't walk away? The question came out as barely a whisper. Matteo took a step closer, and she could smell him, expensive cologne mixed with something darker, something that smelled like power and expensive leather. Then I'm asking you to stay. Not because you owe me. Not because you're afraid. But because you want to. Because I'm asking you to let me be part of your life. And Ava's life. And to let my boys, he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed into something almost broken. They ask about her every morning. Marco wants to teach her how to ride his bicycle. Luca drew her a picture with every color he could find because he said it was for when she felt sad. They're already choosing her, Mia. The question is whether you'll let me choose you. She felt the tears before she felt her own face moving. They came from somewhere deep, somewhere she didn't know still existed. Her shoulders shook, and she sat back down on the sofa like her legs had been cut from underneath her. Why me? Her voice broke apart like old ice. I'm just a waitress. I'm nobody. I have nothing to offer you. I'm a widow with a daughter and a mountain of debt and calluses on my hands from working in a kitchen where people treated me like I was invisible. Why would you want that? Why would you want me? Matteo knelt in front of her. Actually knelt. She watched his knees touch the hardwood floor, and the sight of the most powerful man in Chicago lowering himself before her made something in her chest reorganize itself. Because you showed me what courage looks like, he said. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from having everything to protect. The kind that comes from having nothing and choosing to protect everyone else anyway. You're the woman who reminded me why I built this empire, Mia. Not for money. Not for revenge. But to protect the people who matter. And you made me understand that protecting them means nothing if I don't let anyone matter to me. He reached out and took her hand, pressing it between both of his, and she could feel his pulse, steady and present and alive. You're not nobody, he said. You're the woman who showed my sons that love is real. You're the woman who stood between a blade and my children. You're the woman who jumped in front of death itself without hesitation. You're the strongest person I've ever known. She looked at the deeds, at the checks, at his face. At the absolute certainty in his eyes. What if I'm not strong enough for this? The question came out as a confession. What if I fail? What if I can't be what you need? You already are, he said. You jumped in front of a knife. You're stronger than all of us. The snow fell on Lincoln Park 1 month later, December snow that was gentle and clean and completely indifferent to the fact that Mia Reynolds had been reborn. The brownstone was hers in a way that made her feel like she was stealing something beautiful every time she unlocked the door. 3 bedrooms. A kitchen with sunlight streaming through the windows. a backyard where oak trees stood guard over the small patch of frozen earth. She had painted Ava's bedroom a soft blue, and her daughter had chosen the curtains herself, pale yellow things that looked like captured sunlight. The backyard held for children now instead of two. Marco and Luca had moved in 3 weeks ago, after the final custody paperwork had been signed and finalized. Ava had a family. She had brothers who fought over her at dinner and brought her drawings and taught her jokes that were absolutely terrible and that she laughed at anyway with a pure, uncomplicated joy. Matteo stood on the back porch watching them build a snowman, his hands in the pockets of a charcoal coat that cost more than her annual rent. Sergio stood beside him, and the older man was shaking his head slowly. "You're different now," Sergio said. It wasn't a question. "She changed everything," Matteo replied. Inside the house, Mia knelt in the snow with the children gathered around her like she was some kind of magnet pulling all the light in the world toward this single patch of frozen earth. She helped Ava roll the middle snowball, and Marco packed snow onto it, and Luca added sticks for arms, and none of them were thinking about debt or danger or the kinds of violence that existed in the world outside this small backyard. Ava laughed. Really laughed. The kind of laugh that came from her belly, unguarded and completely free. It was a sound Mia had been terrified she would never hear again, and it moved through her like a blade through butter, precise and transformative. She looked up at the porch, at Matteo standing there with his hands in his pockets, watching her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. Their eyes met across the snow and the children and the small forever they had built together. He smiled. Not the cold smile of a man used to power. Not the smile of someone who had spent his life in darkness. This was a smile that reached his eyes, that softened the angles of his face, that said everything his voice couldn't quite contain. She smiled back. And for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, she felt safe. Not the safety of walls and security systems, though those things surrounded her now. But the deeper safety, the kind that comes from knowing that someone has chosen you completely. That you are not alone. That family is not always bound by blood, but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives. The snow kept falling, gentle and relentless, covering everything in white. And in that moment, with her daughter's laughter in her ears and Matteo's eyes on her face and 2 boys who called her by her name and meant it as a promise, Mia Reynolds understood something that no amount of money or safety could have taught her: love wasn't weakness. Love was the most dangerous weapon in the world. Love was what changed everything. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling us what family means to you. And remember, sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the smallest act of courage. Tomorrow, we have another story that will break your heart and put it back together. Don't miss it. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you all good health, joy, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.